So, why does the GOP pull this sort of bullshit when they are constantly claiming to be the true defenders of democracy and freedom, and the Constitution for that matter? I think the answer is pretty simple, and it involves who they actually represent. It's pretty obvious to most people that money in Washington is a big problem, and politicians of both parties are certainly heavily influenced by wealthy interests. For example, for every dollar spent lobbying Washington on behalf of unions or public interests, corporations spend approximately $34 lobbying on behalf of their private interests. In 2016 alone, corporate interests spent over $3 billion lobbying members of Congress, which is about $6 million per member of Congress. Rich individuals have also invested heavily in supporting their politicians, and it should come as no surprise that the average senator votes in favor of their wealthier constituents a majority of the time. However, this brings up another example of an important false equivalency. According to a study that analyzed voting records from 2001 to 2015, the average U.S. Republican senator voted in favor of their wealthy constituents over their poor ones 86% of the time, whereas the average Democratic senator voted in favor of their rich constituents 35% of the time. Now, if you're like me and believe that every person, regardless of their individual wealth, should have equal representation in Congress in terms of policies their representatives support, then there is no question that one party chooses to listen to their wealthier constituents over the poor more than the other. And if you wanted to remove the growing influence of money from policymaking in the first place, then you would support overturning Citizens United, which was a landmark Supreme Court decision in 2010, where the, again, conservative justices ruled that wealthy individuals and corporations can contribute unlimited and undisclosed amounts of money to politicians because it is considered free speech. Democrats have been opposed to that ruling, and Republicans just have not. And the only people who benefit from it are those with financial stakes in those corporations to begin with, or just wealthy individuals. I know this is kind of a separate topic entirely, which I'll probably address in a later episode, but the Republican economic principle of just trickle-down economics has been proven to be a failure, yet they continue to support it because it benefits the wealthiest Americans at the expense of literally everyone else. And that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make here. The erosion of democracy is very much intentional because it benefits a small minority at the expense of literally everyone else. I mean, not only does today's Republican Party represent wealthier interests, but they also represent a just growing minority of Americans in general, specifically just older white people. And this is the culmination of a coordinated strategy that dates back to Richard Nixon, who was the first president to just directly appeal to low-income white people in the South using racist dog whistles disguised as defending states' rights. Today's Republican Party is 90% white and about 73% white Christians, but the country is just quickly becoming more diverse, both in terms of religion and race. So it's not all that surprising that the Republican base feels like they're losing ground and are locked out of cultural and media power, which is disproportionately urban and diverse. This is also why Republicans have been so defensive of the Electoral College, which gives rural, largely white communities in states like Wyoming far greater representation in Congress than more populated and urban states like California and New York. I know there's a legitimate conservative argument for the Electoral College in terms of ensuring presidential candidates don't just entirely ignore these more rural states and focus on big cities for the votes. But I believe a system that in my relatively short lifetime has twice granted the presidency to someone who lost the popular vote is just not democratic. There are obviously plenty of problems with our overall system of democracy, but Republicans would lose the presidency every time if everyone's vote was truly weighed equally. And instead of changing their platform to keep up with the times and be more inclusive, the GOP has instead chosen to maintain a rigged system that just benefits them. Later this week, I plan on talking to some friends of mine about libertarianism, hopefully for a future episode. And I think one thing that most people, regardless of political ideology, agree on is that our two-party system is just inherently broken because it prevents third-party candidates from ever being given a legitimate opportunity to run for president. But there are ways to enable this that wouldn't require just rewriting the Constitution. And again, Republicans are opposed to it. For example, there's currently something called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is a formal agreement between a number of states to award all of their electoral college votes to whichever candidate won the popular vote across the country. This would ensure that people who live in heavily partisan communities like Chicago, where I grew up, actually feel like their vote for president matters, but it also maintains the proportional representation in Congress. Currently, only 15 states have joined on, all of them led by Democrats, I believe, and without additional Republican states joining, it won't go into effect. So for those who complain about having to choose between a shit taco and a turd sandwich every 4 years, shout out South Park, I want to point out that there is only one party that is offering anything close to a solution that would potentially enable someone like Libertarian candidate Joe Jorgensen an opportunity to compete on the national level. Now, I'm currently a Democrat and I absolutely plan on voting for Biden in November, but I would welcome a third-party candidate like Jorgensen into the national debate under a system that would ensure the three candidates are given equal opportunity. Unfortunately, that just doesn't currently exist. And while I like Biden a lot, my biggest problem with him is that he isn't bold enough to lead this sort of like drastic change. He has historically always kind of conformed to the general wishes of the population, which I know is the role of a politician generally in terms of just representing the majority interests, whatever they may be at that time. But repairing the foundation of our democracy requires a greater vision that I believe perhaps some of the other candidates displayed during the primaries. Biden still seems to think that Trump is just an aberration from the GOP, when in reality he is just a more obvious display of the party's true intentions. And I believe fixing our democracy requires at least acknowledging something as basic as that. I think the reason the GOP has proven just unwilling to check Trump's near daily abuses of power is because at least he's on their team. And I know it's become pointless to point out their hypocrisy, but it just feels like the Republican Party has become the Monstars in Space Jam, and the Democrats are Michael Jordan and the Toon Squad, who are literally just getting the shit kicked out of them while still trying to play by the rules. Republicans aren't even trying to play on a level playing field. And without acknowledging that, Biden and the Democratic Party will never be able to make the adjustments necessary to actually win the game. I believe that in politics, much like in sports, the best team deserves to win, but you still need impartial referees to enforce the rules and guarantee fair play. And I'm just surprised that more people, especially on the right, just don't seem to agree with that basic assumption. Now, I'm going to wrap this up, but before I do, I think it's important to put Trump and the GOP into the larger context of what is happening worldwide. And one of the things I've learned from my study of international politics in college and my experiences living and working abroad is that we are witnessing an undeniable rise of authoritarianism around the world. The current leaders of Hungary, Poland, the Philippines, India, Turkey, Egypt, Brazil, and even a few others are all right-wing strongmen very similar to Trump who are following the Russian-Chinese model of government, which is basically just a kleptocracy that offers some semblance of a democracy in order to fend off complaints from its citizens. Now, these leaders have been successful at capitalizing on the many economic and technological and even cultural changes that have taken place over the last 20 years that have made average people just feel left behind economically and therefore insecure. And the result has been just the rapid concentration of political power and wealth. This past weekend, for example, Belarus saw its largest protests in history as people fled to the streets to protest its recent sham election, in which the country's current leader, who's known as Europe's last dictator, won 80% of the vote in what most people are calling a rigged election. Not far away, Hungary's white nationalist party rigged its electoral system in 2011 to consolidate its power by rewarding friendly businesses, punishing critics, and suppressing independent news media. Also, recently, Hungary's president used the global pandemic to pass a rule that literally allows him to rule by decree. So I mention all this because Trump is just simply a product of this global shift away from democracy, and he has fully embraced many of the tendencies some of these leaders, including Putin, have embraced that the U.S. has always sort of fought against. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I honestly feel like I'm living in 1935 Germany, and the warning signs are literally everywhere, but some people just kind of refuse to actually look for them. And to drive this point home, there was once this iconic poster that was sold at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington that outlined the early warning signs of fascism. And I just want to read through them really quick, and you tell me if any of them sound a little eerily familiar. Powerful and continuing nationalism. disdain for human rights, identification of enemies as a unifying cause, supremacy of the military, rampant sexism, controlled mass media, obsession with national security, religion and government intertwined, corporate power protected, labor power suppressed, disdain for intellectuals and the arts, obsession with crime and punishment, rampant cronyism and corruption, and finally, fraudulent elections. Now, I know this sounds extreme, but I'd say most of those kind of reflect the Republican Party. But let's just use Trump as an example. He has pardoned numerous buddies of his who have committed serious crimes while constantly condemning immigrants, minorities, and liberals for that matter. He's also filled government with grifters interested only in lining their own pockets. He prioritizes loyalty over competence, even though government officials take an oath to serve the Constitution, not the president. He's politicized our military and police to combat peaceful protesters, most notably in Lafayette Square in Washington for a photo op that happened mere weeks ago. And he has consistently attacked the free press on a just near daily basis, routinely calling them the enemy of the people. Numerous military officials and conservative journalists like Chris Wallace have condemned the actions, in addition to plenty of Democrats. But I believe there are just far too many people in government remaining quiet who one day will look back at this moment and probably say something along the lines of, "We were just following orders." I know this sounds corny, but government officials are supposed to ultimately take their marching orders from us, the people. So I think the only way we can fight this erosion of democracy is if the public speaks out, and I'm just not really seeing that happen. With everything that Trump has done over the course of the last 4 years, his approval rating among Republicans has never dipped below 85%. And today, it's around 90%. So for those Trump supporters still listening, you know I love you, but you just can't possibly deny that Trump clearly has an affinity for authoritarian leaders like Putin. And if you truly believe in the American dream where anyone can come here and work hard and earn their citizenship, then I think you just can't continue to support the party and president that so clearly does not share that same vision of democracy. In a recent speech, Trump said he'd consider running for a third term as president because, quote, "they spied on me," end quote, during his first term. And before you just roll your eyes at my suggestion that we're currently living through a slow-moving coup, just keep in mind that 2/3 of attempts by presidents to overstay their term around the world have proven successful. And the only thing that has blocked these attempts were widespread protests, similar to the ones that are happening in Belarus today that I previously mentioned. CIA officials have been warning that our president's behavior resembles what they have seen overthrow democratic governments around the world. But we need folks like you to listen in order to actually make a difference. The common characteristic of any authoritarian country is just an adversarial relationship with the truth. And Trump literally refuses to hear bad news about Russia in his rare intelligence reports, so much so that his advisors literally hide it in written reports so as not to make him angry. Is this not concerning? So what's the solution? Now, I lived and worked in China for a year and a half, and while I was there, I quickly noticed that my Chinese friends were overwhelmingly disinterested in politics. But their apathy was entirely the consequence of a government that actively discouraged participation or any scrutiny. And I fear that our government is literally using the exact same playbook. I know I can often sound a bit whiny and overdramatic and preachy, but it's only because I've seen what it's like to live in a country where you truly have no say in the political process, and I just don't want to see that happen here. I care so much about that desire that when I quit my previous job at the end of 2018, I gave myself until this upcoming election to spend my time and energy trying to educate people in my own way about the day-to-day happenings in politics, because I truly believe that if you pay closer attention, you will see the same thing I see and realize that our democracy is in jeopardy. And although it might sting for some of you, I think the first step to protecting our democracy is voting blue in November, up and down the ballot. As I've said plenty of times before, Democrats are nowhere near perfect, but at least they believe in what our founding fathers envisioned. And I know it sounds hyperbolic, but I believe this upcoming election is literally democracy's last stand, and tuning out completely is just not an option. Trump's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen, recently stated that he doesn't believe Trump will go quietly if he loses in November. And this is something that I don't think enough people are considering seriously as a possibility. The GOP is clearly willing to enable this president's worst tendencies and assist in the deconstruction of democracy, but I still believe they are only getting away with it because not enough people notice that they're doing it right in front of us. I hope I'm wrong in stating that the GOP has just given up on democracy, but I don't see any evidence otherwise.